Good afternoon. Thanks for having me. My name is Charles Feldman. I'm currently the CEO at GPS.global. GPS is a global strategy consulting company, also dealing in the capital markets. I co-founded with my partner, Bob Hoban, who's now a partner at Clark Hill. And we formed an international cannabis consulting company several years ago. And it's my pleasure this afternoon to help Marla out and talk a little bit about international cannabis. A little bit about myself, so you know who you're listening to and really what got me into the international cannabis marketplace. I like to say that I started in the cannabis industry about 30 years ago. I've been a practicing attorney coming up on 30 years now. And I started that career way back in the Marine Corps. I was a prosecutor and a defense counsel, went through law school through the Marine Corps, and worked early on in a lot of big marijuana, narcotics prosecutions in the San Diego area. That was my first real entry into what we call the war on drugs. It was a first taste of the amount of government resources that was going into that war. I was a soldier on the front lines of that war and did that throughout my active duty career. When I left the Marine Corps, I then began working with a DEA drug task force. I was the commander of that task force, and I was responsible for putting together the multi-agency task force, leading those agents, building the warrants, the probable cause, and then ultimately prosecuting the cases that we generated out of that task force. That experience with the DEA certainly formed for me very early on what the war on drugs was more about than what I thought. I went into it as a good soldier, believing that combating illicit drugs was certainly an important priority, community-wise, nationwide. But I also got to see firsthand the disparity in what we prosecuted. And the constantly changing priorities, and how economic resources were tied to arrests and seizures. And that was a very eye-opening experience for me. I ended up being a state narcotics prosecutor after that for a stint, and then founded my own law firm and was in private practice for the last 15 years. When I think about international cannabis and where I started from to where I practice now, it really began when Colorado, which is where I'm from and presently reside, began its social experiment and began passing legislation passed by the citizens of Colorado to move medical marijuana forward, and then eventually adult use recreational. And as a law firm, similar to what a bunch of attorneys today have to go through in their particular states, Colorado had a prohibition against attorneys helping cannabis clients. And so early on, we had to figure out how to navigate the ethics of trying to guide clients who were wanting to lawfully engage in cannabis business. It does not escape me today that I assist clients in being very profitable, making a lot of money in an industry that not very long ago they would have gone to prison for. That's not lost on me. And I certainly talk a lot about that when I'm on the international stage. What I like to start, though, and talk about is an important quote. You can't get enough of Tommy Chong. And of course, his important quote that we'll start this presentation with is, "You can tell what age people are by the words they use." And I think that's really important and says a lot about cannabis and the evolution of cannabis. So we all now use the word cannabis. We use words like CBD, THC. But I always like to go back and think about where that started from and kind of what the vernacular was that led us to what is today a very sophisticated international marketplace, and one that is continuing to grow. So some of my favorite words, and again, I would think about this when you're dealing with your clients and in your own practice, what words do they use? Because it will tell you a lot about their mindset of how they're approaching legalized cannabis. Some of my favorites, we all started with grass, hash, pot, still a good one, right? Weed. How about dank? Anyone ever come across that one? Reefer. Of course, my favorite's got to be Mary Jane. Skunk. That was certainly one we came across a lot of. A very big term in the law enforcement community was dope. In international terms, how about some of the international slang for cannabis, ganja and keef? Certainly you will see even more so today some of the references in some of the conservative sides, the devil's lettuce and wacky tobacco. Got to be a favorite. I will tell you on the international front, these terms are important because there's still a lot of confusion on what cannabis is. In different countries, different areas of the world will use a different form of presentation when they're talking about cannabis. And so I found it important when I start conversation with clients overseas or in different markets that we ensure we know what we're talking about. As cannabis does include marijuana and the hemp side. So two very different marketplaces are properly referred to as cannabis, not always the same around the world. And again, a lot of the terms that people use will be important to know exactly what they're trying to accomplish. So let's start talking a little bit about why international cannabis. So what I'd like to do with my 45 minutes or so is I'm not going to be able to give you a deep dive regulatory analysis on all of the many countries out there that now have some form of cannabis. That literally would take us days to go through, and it's very complicated. The kind of projects that I work on right now are far more of the M&A type, really putting deals together, building partnerships. I'll talk a little bit later about a global supply chain. That is really something my company GPS is focused on, is bringing together that world supply chain. But cannabis has turned capitalistic, and there's no sense denying that, nor do I think anyone should be embarrassed about that. It is a capitalistic endeavor. That's much how the world sees it. But wrapped up with inside that are a lot of different layers to that model. And so I always like to start with clients and sort of talk about, especially if we're talking about a global world stage, what does that marketplace look like? Where are your clients from? Where are you guiding and directing them? Where can you be a resource? Even if you're an attorney practicing in the state of Louisiana, as I hope you will see going through this, you will realize that the bubble that you operate in is actually much bigger than you may have thought it was. One of the things I learned when I first entered the international cannabis place, that marketplace, was just in the United States how much we live inside our bubble. We really have a tendency to think, oh, this is really what cannabis is about. If you're practicing in your state, or you're working with clients, or you're a client yourself, trying to get into a marketplace, we can be very narrowly focused on that license that's right in front of us, the consumer or the client base or the business model. And what I saw on the international stage was it's a very big marketplace. It's intertwined. It's complicated, extremely complicated. There's a lot of money out there. There are governments involved. And so I really now try to encourage people to get outside and just, even if not today, if it's not relevant to your practice today, I promise you at some point in your career or at some point in your business, if you're in cannabis very long, you will be dealing with other places, other countries, other markets. And so I think it's important to think about that. So I always start with clients. I am a business attorney. I help CEOs and executives and boards build profitable cannabis businesses around the world. And we always start with, what's your client base? What is your consumer base? What does that market look like? So let's start small. Louisiana, about 4.7 million people. So that's the world that you operate in. 4.7 million potential consumers, clients. That's the bubble that you're operating in the state of Louisiana, and grow from there. So what's our next big marketplace that you hear a lot about these days? New York, 19 million people in New York. I go up from there. Florida, 22 million. Texas, 29 million people. And then you work your way up to California, that is at 39 million people. And that's pretty significant when we start talking about population and the amount of patients, clients, consumers of products. So that's the United States. So those are sort of the big 5 marketplaces in the United States, and they all hover, from 20 million to California, bumping up on that $40 million potential, 40 million people in patients. Then let's think now let's sort of expand our horizons so we kind of have a sense of what the cannabis world's like out there. How about Canada? 38 million. So Canada has a smaller consumer base than the state of California, similar to, a couple other states added in there. So again, there's in the last several years been a lot of business and money that's flowed into Canada. And when you look at the international marketplace for that, it's really not all that big. It's not a very big market for a national international cannabis platform. Colombia, an area, and I'll talk a little bit more about Colombia, but Colombia is one of those countries that has very aggressively embraced cannabis. Coming from my DEA law enforcement days, the cartel days, they have very actively and aggressively moved into a very legalized cannabis culture. But they're 51 million. So again, a significant bump from Canada or California. And then I look at places like Mexico. We'll get to Mexico here shortly. Another very exciting marketplace to be aware of if you're not already. Population of 126 million people. So something worth being a part of. And then it goes from there. You look at the EU, 446 million people in the EU. India, where we're working now, we're working on one of the first export licenses, building that out for an export licensee in India, working with the prime minister and the government. Almost 1.5 billion people in India. 1.5 billion. So when you think about Louisiana in our bubble, and then the United States, United States has a total of 332 million population. Now we're talking about places like India, 1.5 billion. We haven't even got, up from there when you get into places like China and other places in Asia. So I go back to encouraging you to think about the bigger picture of cannabis. Constantly push yourself in your practice to think about what else is going on and how does that impact my practice right now or my clients. Or if you're a business owner, what else you're going to see is what's coming down the road as far as this global supply chain. Who are my competitors going to be, not only today, but tomorrow? The next thing I like to do when I talk about is around the world is I try to center, when I speak on international cannabis events, I try to center the topic on, let's have an understanding of what cannabis actually is from a capitalistic point of view. And I always like to use, the 50-gallon barrel of crude oil. So, you come from a state with a lot of oil refineries down there in Louisiana and Texas area, Florida. So picture in your mind a 50-gallon drum of crude oil. That drum today is selling for about $72 for that barrel, 50 gallons crude oil. Let's compare that. How about we compare it to that same 50-gallon barrel of premium unleaded gasoline, top of the line gasoline. You could buy a 50-gallon barrel for about $172 in the state of Louisiana. That's about what your gas is going for. How about milk? Your milk in Louisiana is about $3.50, about $3.6 a gallon. So you could buy that same 50-gallon drum of milk in Louisiana for about $183. If you were in Springfield, Illinois, which I did not know has the cheapest milk in the country, 93 cents a gallon. How about this one? Perrier water, right? Of course, you all drink your Perrier water. If we were to fill a 50-gallon drum from Amazon Perrier water, that would cost us $384. Okay, let's try to take it up there a little bit. How about a 50-gallon drum filled, this crude oil barrel filled with pure gold? What would that be worth? About $14 million. About 8,000 pounds of gold would fit in that barrel, and you'd have about $14 million. Now, how about, now it gets exciting. Now we move into what is cannabis worth. If we filled that same barrel with THC extract oil, any idea what that's worth? About $14 million right now. When I first started doing this speech, it was much higher. Those prices have come down now. So THC extract oil is worth about the same as gold right now as a commodity. But even better, how about pure CBD oil? Anybody have an idea of what 50-gallon drum barrel? $24.5 million. That's how much pure CBD oil is worth. So it's a great exercise to think about, though, of this cannabis commodity and where it's going and really what you've become a part of now as this commodity change. It has enormous value. It's not just rag weed in a joint that someone's smoking in an alleyway. When we're talking about something that is worth far more than gold, pure gold, I think it puts it into context of how important this industry is and what it is as a commodity. So let's talk a little bit more about this global supply chain. So in any time talking about international cannabis, I think we always have to go and talk about exactly what are some of those drug laws out there. And the first thing you will always come across, it's what's called, and you've probably heard it. If not, it's called the Single Convention on Narcotic Drugs. It's a United Nations international law. It has about 180 countries that have signed up. And again, if you're not familiar with how much of an impact the United States war on drugs have had around the world, take some time and go study that international law. I'm not going to spend a lot of time on it here, but it's a UN international law that all of these countries at U.S. influence, using our influence over the last 50 years to drive these countries to adopt the United States version of how to approach drugs. And that's from a very strong criminal law enforcement, criminal justice mindset. And why that's important is that has impacted countries around the world. And they are still having to move from under that heavy-handed law enforcement conservative influence that the United States has peddled around the world. And we still run into that. We still run into countries like Canada when they legalize Uruguay, when they completely legalized Canada or cannabis, they became now in violation of this particular convention. And there still hasn't been a resolution to it. It's sort of like, well, what does that mean now? And so again, as a practicing attorney, on the international front, it will be something you're asked a lot about of how does this work? How do countries like Canada and Uruguay get around it? Well, they don't, and they haven't. Some of the best answers is they've just chosen to ignore it, almost much like the federal government is ignoring the state-by-state rollout of cannabis in the United States. But again, you'll see this international U.S.-driven war on drugs policy. We just saw it in the current Olympics. Sprinter Carrie Richardson just got banned, probably one of the fastest women alive on the planet, for testing positive for THC. If you remember in 2009, Michael Phelps had the same thing. He got a 3-month ban for just taking a picture with a joint, not even a positive. So a lot of that comes from this U.S. anti-doping agency, this drug convention, international law, war on drugs that the United States continues to push around the world. So again, where I'm going with a lot of this is trying to push you outside of your practice bubble and continually challenging you to think about how what you're doing and working with clients is impacting others around the world. So again, that's really all I want to talk about that. If there's more, there's so much written about that. It's a great topic. Let's talk about Mexico a little bit. Right there on our southern border, it's going to be very soon, most likely by the end of the year, when Mexico has a program that rivals Canada. And Mexico, to me, is one of the first countries where the international cannabis marketplace gets really exciting. You think about the United States between two fully legalized countries very soon, and what that means, what now the reverse of that is on law enforcement and this war on drugs culture that we have inherited. It's just a complete opposite flip, and it's just fascinating to think about everyone having legalized except us. Mexico, it involves NAFTA. It's going to have treaties. It's going to have trade. All of that is going to go into what's going on in Mexico. And the thing I really like about Mexico is every country has its own history. Every country has evolved in their cannabis program in their own unique way. You're seeing the United States. We're all very familiar with how that rolls out in the United States. And sometimes we have we assume that's just the same for everybody else when it's not. What I liked about in Mexico is in 2018, the Mexican Supreme Court ruled and declared that the personal use and possession of cannabis was a fundamental human right. Think about that. A Supreme Court of a country, of a very large country, 126 million people, half the size of the United States. Their Supreme Court ruled it is a fundamental human right to the personal use and possession of cannabis. So that took off, and it hasn't been fully implemented yet. We thought it was going to get done early this year, and it has gotten delayed yet again. Although the attorneys that we work with inside Mexico are pretty well committed right now that with the new elections taking place this fall, we will see the implementation of that Supreme Court directive taking place, maybe very much by the end of this year, if not early next year. So think of that when that happens, when Mexico becomes the next Canada, and you now have the ability to have a very free-flowing commerce throughout that country for not only hemp, THC, CBD, international exchange. What is that going to do? Again, I want to start you thinking about what is that going to do for your local clients? At some point, where I'm going with a lot of this is at some point, your clients are going to be competing on an international stage. And with Mexico literally miles away from you, what is that competition going to look like? How will Mexico change the landscape? And again, I don't have time to go into all that would entail. But again, I'm really trying to plant some seeds for you to begin to think about and for you to begin to see what's coming. Another similar country is Colombia. So Colombia, a 51 million population country. So again, bigger than California, about the size of Texas and Florida put together. Colombia, now think about this. Colombia has a legalized model. They have export licenses to the international community. They have cultivation, manufacturing, distribution licenses. You're seeing big flows of capital into that country and building that out. And my own company at GPS, we've got an office starting in Mexico this year and Colombia next year. So you can see sort of where we see the value of Colombia. But again, I put this in the same context as Mexico. And I kind of go back to Canada a little bit. Now, think about Canada. Canada's almost entire cannabis community, its entire business model is based around indoor grows. Think about the state of Louisiana starting. Think about the investments going into indoor grows. Massive carbon footprints. They consume an enormous amount of electricity and water and resources. Think about your human labor costs. Now, think about just a year or two or a few years from now, in the blink of an eye in the cannabis world, when you are competing, when your clients, when you're yourself as a business owner are competing with Mexico and Colombia, think of their low labor costs. Think about the labor costs in Mexico and Colombia and your labor costs in Louisiana. Think about the outdoor cultivation friendly environment. Colombia and Mexico are God created the best indoor grows for cannabis, only it's all outside. It's free sunshine. Marijuana, hemp, cannabis grows unbelievably the best under sunshine. So that's now going to become your competition for indoor grows. Imagine what Canada's marketplace is going to look like when there's a free-flowing commodity, when cannabis can freely flow back and forth, and these countries have developed their particular marketplace. It's going to be very exciting, and it's going to be very different than what exists right now. So again, I just pay attention to where you see Colombia. South America is, again, another one. Countries like Brazil, Argentina, that just think about, again, the labor costs, free sunshine, a very small carbon footprint, and now that's who you're going to compete with. You know, we go back in time and we talk about cheap products being able to be produced in China that overtook the U.S. marketplace. They had a cheap labor source. They had a government-focused manufacturing sector. I think you're going to start to see very soon the same thing in cannabis. That international influence is going to have a huge impact on supply and that global supply chain. Okay, just a couple more countries I just want to bring to your attention for you to kind of think about a little bit. Australia may be one you haven't really thought about, but Australia is getting a lot of action today. There was actually, I think either yesterday or today, Flora Growth announced a big joint venture with an Australian importer. They're estimating a $1.5 billion marketplace in 4 years. The thing about Australia, think about similar to Louisiana, is it's a pharmacy model. And so they don't have the dispensaries, they use the pharmacies, and they have CBD flowing over the counter. That's not within the pharmaceutical model. But the THC side is going to live within that pharmacy model. As I've worked in international cannabis now the last 5 years, I've seen many different countries want to explore the pharmacy model. The United States, state by state, has pushed back in large fashion against that. Certainly the retail industry has pushed back against that becoming. There's chatter at the federal level at the U.S. that would be something as a path towards federal legalization. So I think it's worth paying attention in Australia to see, does that model take hold? Do the consumers and the patients follow it? Do they like it? My big question, though, will be, you know, again, when I go back to the international, that global supply chain, is Australia too remote? It's a long ways away from a lot of the consumers that will use once you get outside of that local patient base. And so that'll be another question that I raise for those investing, putting capital. We worked right out of Denver. One of our clients worked very much in the CBD space there and bringing some of their products and brands into Australia. So again, pay attention to that over time to sort of see how that pharmacy model continues to develop. Another interesting one to talk about and think about and keep on the forefront of your mind is Thailand. And you think, Thailand? Who cares about Thailand? Well, why I would bring that up is it has enormous influence on that particular region and what's going on. And so how this model continues to roll out from a very conservative government and culture, that war on drugs is very strong in that area, in that region. And so seeing how that develops, and most importantly for me, how quickly it evolves. Is this something that takes 10 years? Or as some are saying, in months worth of time, you're going to see the continued rollout as the government continues to expand their regulations and permit more hemp and CBD and cannabis in their products. They're also really focused on cosmetics in their marketplace, which is a giant interest around the world. That is one of the most exciting areas where capital is flowing, is into the cosmetic industry and using cannabis ingredients within that industry. Another country, a small country, but one that has been in cannabis for a very long time is the state of Israel. I have worked on numerous clients as an attorney with clients out of Israel, and some of those were as simple as setting up corporate bank accounts. And if you haven't done that for international clients, it's not easy anymore with the Patriot Act to set up international companies, international bank accounts with domestic U.S. Companies. I've worked with real estate investors, REITs that have come over and set up their REITs in the United States. And so a lot of flow of international cannabis or international cannabis. So how does that money get from Israel or another country into the U.S. and deployed either in an ancillary cannabis marketplace? There's some pretty sophisticated legal work that's gone into that. Israel also is very big on the intellectual property. So if you don't know, Israel has been doing human testing in cannabis in their hospitals with their veterans for decades. They have some of the most expansive medical science around the world when it comes to the testing on humans of cannabis. I actually had the privilege to speak with a cancer doctor once around the world who had actually cured a very rare form of cancer. They actually had the patent, and this wasn't marijuana that was, slowing the growth, actually had cured cancer. So that's the kind of studies and science that's going on in the state of Israel right now. I've seen clients and others take their products there to continue to do some of that testing. And I think you'll see more of that value as the FDA here on the U.S. side continues to expand and seeks the science side. As you see the DEA continue to open up the research side to those DEA licenses. Again, pay attention to Israel and what you're going to see as far as intellectual property, science, some of those studies. I would also say on Israel, before I move that, they are a world leader in agriculture. Countries from around the world go to Israel to see the technology they have for growing in the desert, where every drop of water is precious, and they are capitalizing on that intellectual property and being able to market that around the world. Obviously has enormous impact on the cannabis marketplace. Germany, another very important international cannabis location. Germany is the center of the EU. And if you don't remember, the EU is about 450 million people. So that's a massive marketplace. Why do I bring up Germany? Why is Germany important? Germany is one of the first to allow insurance programs to pay for cannabis with their medical marijuana, cannabis, and patients. They had one of the first insurance programs that the government allowed for insurance to compensate patients for their cannabis prescriptions. That is something being studied around the world. I run into that over and over and over again of when will insurance companies, it's certainly a big question in the United States, when will patients be able to have, their cannabis medicine covered by their insurance program? When will Medicaid and Medicare cover that sort of stuff? So I think we're a long ways from that. But again, Germany's doing it right now. So Why I think that's interesting and something to watch and pay attention to and think about will be how that develops throughout the EU and around the rest of the world. Germany is also the entry into the EU. So once you get inside the EU, you can then operate within that entire platform. And so having those entry points for your products, for your clients' products, is a very important tactical decision. I'm seeing companies use Portugal as another entry place. And I think Germany continues to remain at the top of the most legitimate commercialized medical marijuana programs within the EU. It's also one of the most liberal aspects to that. I finally kind of end back up talking a little bit more about Canada. So if you haven't gotten the sense yet, I'm not a giant fan of steering my clients' capital into the Canadian market. That happened several years ago, and I think it was a massive disaster. We sort of saw that sort of .com bubble burst. People were paying billions of dollars for companies that had zero revenue. They had no revenue. They had never even grown a plant. They hadn't even built, and they were pro forma outing, their revenues to the moon. And we saw just a lot of that crash. And that's important. Not only as a learning lesson, it's also important to other countries, such as Mexico coming online, to learn from that, for capital being invested in there, to have an understanding of that history and what works. But why is Canada still relevant, and why you still see money flowing in there, even though I do not think Canada is a long-term player in this global supply chain, just because of their climate, because of the intensity of indoor grows, and they just will never be able to compete with the free sunshine of South America and other parts of the world that can grow for free. So the plus of Canada, why Canada stays relevant, is maybe for the simple fact of their exchange. It is the one place in sort of Western culture, Western business, that you can take your company into a public setting and list on the exchange. Canada has a couple different exchanges. We've worked with clients setting that up, working with that. I'm in the middle of a very large M&A deal that's contemplating doing exactly that with U.S. MSOs rolling up and creating their IPO on the Canadian exchange. So that exchange has actually turned out to be very valuable. And maybe in the end, that will be, Canada's number one contribution to that sort of global supply chain. I briefly sort of wanted to wrap up here and talk to you a little bit more about this global supply chain. And if you haven't thought about it or you haven't participated in it, it's a seed that I really want to plant in your mind and take back with you after the seminar. What we are seeing with the commoditization of hemp products, marijuana ingredients, and again, that's what I call CBD. It's just an ingredient. It's one of many. And where those turn out, CBD may turn out to be just a giant nothing. When we see the other ingredients of this plant have far more pharmaceutical value or tested value. But our company GPS has worked, with probably about 45 different governments drafting their regulations, helping them build those marketplaces. We're working right now with a client in India, one of the first and only export licenses in India, right at the birthplace of marijuana, to build out their entire ecosystem, from what does the grow need to look like, all the way to what are the finished products need to look like. And the point of this maybe long-winded story here is it doesn't end there. That's really where it begins, and where I think we'll also see on the U.S. front, where do those products then go? Where are those consumers? And we have been actively working hard to help build that global supply chain, where you have consumers across the world, not just in your backyard. So, think of the day when Louisiana's 4.5 million people is not just the limit of your consumer base. Think of the day when you can actually have, a world-changing product that can compete around the world. And there is a pathway for that global supply chain. There's a pathway for you to take your amazing product that you've come up with or your client has come up with. And we actually have the roadmap for where that can go. Colombia is trying to figure that out now. They have a very strong export model. That's their country's goal. And now trying to figure out where you can land that. And some of the difficulties that we see with that is coming from many different countries have very different testing requirements, manufacturing requirements. The EU is different than the US. Canada is going to be different than Mexico. So again, we'll see, a pharmaceutical grade THC tincture may not have been manufactured in Colombia the way it needed to be to enter into the German medical marijuana marketplace. So those are the kind of things we're working on in India right now to help them guide and build those so that when we have that final finished product, we have the most expansive marketplace for that to go to. The world ecosystem is being formed right now. And again, why I think this is important within the context of everything else you're learning in this 2-day seminar is someday, very soon, your clients and your products are going to be competing with Colombia and India and Mexico and Brazil. They're going to be competing with scientific studies coming out of Israel. They'll be competing with a well-defined capital marketplace in Canada. They will be competing with free sunshine, cheap labor markets and cheap labor sources. Heavy carbon footprints will become under far greater scrutiny than they have in the past. And again, all of that leads us back to what I think is just that 50-gallon barrel. And right now, that CBD oil is almost double the value as gold, pure gold is. And so it's a very exciting industry. It's been a pleasure to be a part of the industry. And for those out there who sometimes say, "Oh, it's too late to get into this," you're too late. If you're an attorney wanting to start in this practice or a client wanting to enter the business, I say that's nonsense. Absolute nonsense. And I hope this presentation, by showing you just how big the world is, how yet unexplored it is, how much farther there is to go, there's just so much room for competition, so much more room for some unique brands and some unique growth and some really brilliant entrepreneurs in this industry. So my final request for those listening, and again, I like to answer, so if no one else has questions or anything as we get to that, I would love to hear back from you, any thoughts you have pivoting to the U.S. side on what you see is going to happen with federal legalization. I love to take this survey whenever I talk somewhere else and find out what people are thinking. I think it's fascinating to get a beat on, hey, when will the United States federally legalize? What pathway do you see that? Is that tomorrow? Is that never? Is that 20 years from now? Is that during the Biden administration? Is it the next administration? So if nothing else, please share those thoughts with me, and I'd love to hear them.
Mr. Charles, we have a few questions here.
All right.
Okay. The first question, how do you become a multi-state license holder? Question mark.
That's a great question. In the United States, and I'll keep these confined on the United States front, it's a very difficult and expensive proposition because you basically have to rebuild your entire business model state by state. So assuming we're talking about THC and we're not talking about hemp, and if that assumption is wrong, let me know. And I'll try to kill my fly here. I promised I would speak about my fly. But what I'm in the multi-state operators, you have to keep everything vertical within the boundaries of your state. Because we have not had federal legalization yet, there's no interstate commerce for THC products, which means multi-state operators, and the ones that I work with, they built a complete operation in Colorado. And now they've gone in Michigan and they've built another complete separate operation. The only parent companies that we see can be up at at the levels where through some sophisticated legal mechanisms, you can share profits and you can roll up some of those through licensing agreements and intellectual property and stuff like that. But that's the only way to do it. And it's very expensive. It's not cheap, and it's not an easy way to go about it.
Okay, question number 2, while we have a couple more minutes. Attorney Feldman, international cannabis attorneys need to know mergers and acquisitions, securities, import/export, and supply chain, question mark.
What was the question? That was a mouthful.
you in that little fly. All right, I'll read it once more. Attorney Feldman, international cannabis attorneys need to know mergers and acquisitions, securities, import/export, and supply chain, question mark.
Yes. International attorneys are going to practice in all of those practice areas. And so if I'm understanding the question correctly, having that background, again, I've always pushed back on a cannabis attorney. In my mind, there's no such thing as a cannabis attorney. There's certainly no such thing as an international cannabis attorney. What there really is, in my mind, is good business attorneys, attorneys who have some real good skills in corporate securities, putting partnerships together, taking partnerships apart. To me, that's the main bread and butter to cannabis attorneys. There certainly are regulatory aspects, but again, even in my experience on the state-by-state case, those are small when compared to the larger scheme of what's taking place. So corporate law, to me, is number one for any cannabis attorney.
Okay, and the final question is, we have a few people that would like you to please provide your information.
Yes, it's simple. It's my initials, CEF, Charlie Echo Foxtrot, at gps.global. Email me there anytime. I'm happy to help connect you. I'm a big believer in networks. So if there's anything that I can do to, hey, I've got a client going to Australia. Great. I know that local attorney I can help connect you with, or we'll have that within our network. So CEF at gps.global.
Okay, one more just popped up. Look like we have a few more seconds. From the international perspective, based on the process of growing hemp, do you see places like Canada needing to import the raw material? Question mark.
Yes, absolutely. I think that's a great way of saying what I was alluding to earlier in this presentation was I don't think places geographically like that where that's not a big agricultural producing country. Canada is not known for big ag. And in my mind, that's where this commodity will end up. It will be a big ag play. There certainly will be the pharmaceutical sides and medicine and the recreational, but this will be a big ag play. And I don't see Canada competing with traditional big ag countries.
Okay, Attorney Feldman, that seems to be all of the questions that we have at this time. Get you in that fly. We appreciate you and thank you so much for your presentation.
You're welcome.
Have a good day.
You too.